During World War I, it was called shell shock, when soldiers were traumatized by the sights, sounds and many other things of the battlefield. Today we call it post-traumatic stress disorder. But are people being diagnosed correctly, or could a new treatment perhaps help to ease the suffering? Good to have your company. I'm David Foster. You're watching Roundtable. The typical treatment for PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, has been medication and psychological therapies. But in the last few years, there have been a number of exciting new developments, direct impulses in some cases into the brain. Today, we also meet a Palestinian doctor who actually says, PTSD, we haven't got the time for it here.
It was called shell shock in the world wars. Now it's called post-traumatic stress disorder. PTSD was first recognized as a condition in 1980 by the American Psychiatric Association. This anxiety disorder doesn't discriminate and can be brought on by experiencing or witnessing stressful events. According to a report by the International Journal of Mental Health Systems, 23.2% of Palestinians suffer from PTSD, while in the UK the rate is around 4 to 5% of the population. New experimental therapies include sending bursts of electric current to patients' brains. But does Western methodology apply to all? And could this change the way PTSD is treated?
Let us go to Ramallah in the West Bank, the occupied West Bank, where we can talk to Dr. Samah Jabr, Head of Mental Health at the Palestinian Ministry of Health, to Augusta in the United States, and Nagy Youssef, Dr. Nagy Youssef, Associate Professor and Director of Mood Disorders and Trauma Lab at Augusta University. With me at the round table, Steve Wilkins, lead coach in the north of England for Save Our Soldiers. Himself, he believes, a victim of post-traumatic stress injury. That's how he puts it. And Dr. Martyn, Bignold, clinical psychologist. Listen, thanks everybody for coming in. Let's go to Dr. Jabr first in the West Bank. The headline that came with the article I read said, post-traumatic stress disorder, a Western concept, a Western luxury. Now take the headline writer away from this. What you mean, I think, is that the way people in an area of permanent conflict, such as yours, have to deal with this is very different to people who go to a conflict zone, then leave, and then get ill.
That's right. I think the term PTSD best captures the experience of soldiers who move to a different geographical zone, and then they go back to the safety of their home, and they are still troubled by the experiences and the psychological consequences that resulted from their experience. PTSD does not capture the Palestinian experience in the best way because there is no post phase for Palestinians. Trauma is ongoing, it's continuous and repetitive. And the other reservation about the term post-traumatic stress disorder is that much of the psychological harm that is done to Palestinians does not meet the criteria of the definition of a traumatic experience. According to the definition, we are talking about death or serious injury or sexual violence. And sometimes the experience of Palestinians is an experience of humiliation, objectification, betrayal, which does a lot of harm, but it does not meet the definition of a traumatic experience, the psychiatric definition of a traumatic experience.
Let me ask you a question about this. If you took out the word post and you took out the word trauma, you're left with an injury to a human being in a particular situation. So what differentiates what the Palestinians in Gaza and in the West Bank suffer from a soldier? Is it a physical detachment from the battlefield?
Of course, there is a lot of psychological morbidity that is influenced by the social and political determinants of life under occupation. The fact that we cannot match some terminology from the manual, from the Western manual of psychiatric disorders to certain experiences of Palestinians does not mean that the psychological morbidity does not exist. Because what is special about the Palestinian experience is the collective experience, the collective trauma and the historical trauma. And I think the diagnostic categories that are made in the West, and they are dominated, and they can describe the experiences of some Palestinians, but not all of Palestinians. They are individualized. They are adapted to the individualized experience. And many of the Palestinians, they are affected by a psychological experience that is influenced by the experience of their neighbors, of other countrymen, of the huge losses that people suffer from.
Samah, thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Martyn, as a doctor in this field, do you recognize what Samah is saying? And is there perhaps a Western danger of putting an umbrella term over something that simply involves an emotional experience from which it's difficult to recover?
Absolutely. I can only agree with Dr. Jabr. The term PTSD, in fact, I would say it's an even smaller umbrella than just to say it's a Western definition. We need to be clear, it's Western. You could say it's largely dominated by English-speaking countries. So, of course, the DSM, this is the statistical and diagnostic criteria by which we define some disorders. The World Health Organization has a similar kind of categorization. They're speaking about a very specific disorder, and only from the point of view of what is largely not just Western but English-speaking populations, and that's not the only limitation. This is just the point of view of the West at the moment, in the early 21st century. We need to be clear that barely 20 years ago we had a different idea of PTSD, and 100 years ago we had a different idea. This thing that we're calling PTSD is seen in different populations. I would say if we could think of the underlying structures of the brain are recognized, are well known, and they, of course, are universal, not just within humans, but this is a part of the brain which is also present in mammals and also present even in reptiles. The fight or flight response, the amygdala. Now, we can see that that plays a role, but that isn't enough to tell us much about what the human experience is. What we see then is the thing that determines affects our experience after a traumatic incident is the meaning that we make of it.
Can I just ask you this? Why do you think, therefore, if you follow what Dr. Jabr is saying, why do you think, therefore, that people in a permanent conflict zone, permanent state of fear, have what could be determined as a different condition to those that have left that behind but still bring with them an injury?
Well, we see that range of responses, and it is quite well understood, because we come back to this, the meaning that people make of the injuries they had. That meaning is in some ways defined by the society they live in, their expectations, and their individual differences. If we take it out of the conflict zone, something that is more often used as an example is the physical injuries caused in something like an earthquake, a natural disaster, an avalanche. You could categorize there 100 people are injured, there might be so many fatalities, so many broken bones, so many walking wounded. You could have exactly the same injuries in a similar number of people in a war zone that would produce quite a different response, depending whether they're soldiers.
I'm asking really why.
Why? Because the meaning that we make of it, it seems to make us more vulnerable to developing specifically PTSD if we think other human beings are involved. The kind of act of God nature of an avalanche or an earthquake, we have those injuries, but some way, maybe there is something along acceptance, well, this is what happens. If in that circumstance, though, that injury comes from the hands of another human being, somebody got up this morning with the intention of harming me and the people around me, the meaning that we make of it has an impact on how then the consequences of that trauma. If the meaning you make of it is actually where I live in an occupied territory and I see this going on around and this maybe is part and parcel of my and others' experience, that's a different meaning to I was sent here, I've come home to to be into a conflict which is, you might think, unpopular amongst other people back home, or I've come home to have no aftercare from the armed forces that sent me here, or I've come home to other physical injuries which are not getting addressed, the meaning you make is going to be different.
Okay, get it. Let's talk about what it's like.
The civilian population of Palestine, here's your answer. They live in a violent country every day. That to them is normal. Now, post-traumatic stress injury is a normal reaction to an abnormal situation.
What did it do to you? You went to Northern Ireland, you went to Iraq, you went to what is now Kurdistan. What particularly affected you?
You go to these places, you're trained to go to these places to fight. What you're not trained is what you're going to see there, how it's going to emotionally affect you. Now, post-traumatic stress can rear its head a day, a week, months, years later. The majority of cases, it will rear their head 10 to 15 years later, which it did with me.
Do you know what it was that caused
both
the injury in the first place, but then for it to appear more than a decade later?
Yes, there was something that I did see in Iraq in 1991, which was basically just shoved to the back of the mind. And when I'd left the Marines, it resurfaced when I had time to reflect. And that's what's happened with a lot of veterans. Once you've got time to reflect, and the transitional period from leaving the forces to joining civilian life, there's your problem as well.
Steve, I'm going to come to you a little bit later on about sort of how you look after these particular soldiers. But I want to go to Nagy over there, because you've looked into mood disorders, Nagy. I mean, there is no particular term that is correctly applicable in this situation. But if you are dealing, and let's call it, with PTSD, I talked about medication, I talked about psychology, but there is a physical, perhaps cure that is being looked into. You're part of that. What are you experimenting with?
There is emerging investigational scientific research, and there is a small amount of data and trials on electroconvulsive therapy and other forms of brain stimulation like transcranial magnetic stimulation. So basically, this still not in the clinical domain yet, and there should be more trials, so we don't know for sure how effective that will be, but there is early treatment that it might help.
Does this suggest to you and to other professionals that there is a physical injury that is caused as well as an emotional injury in traumatic situations?
Yes, David, you're absolutely right. I think there is. So although it starts as environment or trauma, psychological trauma, and I agree with Dr. Jabr, it's PTSD by definition has to be a very severe trauma that's witnessing death or the person almost died, or severe injury to the psyche, like sexual trauma and others. But it over time, especially when it's repeated and chronic, it can create brain changes that actually we can see on brain imaging like functional MRI and PET scans. And it can change the circuits in the brain actually, and how nerves talk to each other.
And can you reset this with you talked about ECT, electroconvulsive therapy, but there's also a form of electromagnetic therapy. Do you effectively sort of take it back to how it was before, but leave the rest of the brain hopefully intact?
Yes. Yeah, well, these treatments doesn't cause any harm to the brain. It just try to modify the circuits, so to speak, that has been dysfunctional because of the traumatic event or the years of trauma, depending on the PTSD. But sometimes people that can be exposed to stressful events that's not life-threatening, and at least in DSM-4, it's called adjustment disorder, where people have to adjust to the situation. And I agree also that the meaning of the trauma is extremely important, which makes some people have PTSD and some people don't, even though exposed to the same traumatic event.
Dr. Jabr, Nagy, because I want to get everybody involved in this as a bit of a discussion.
Sure.
You've heard what the other people on the panel have said, Dr. Jabr, and I called you Sabah at the beginning. Apologies for that. Your first name is Samah. You've heard what they've said. Do you think there is a correct approach to treating traumatic injury, whether it happens to be PTSD or something else, and how could that be applied to people that you have to deal with?
What we do in Palestine is that we try to adapt our resources to the big demand in the community. So we have few professionals and very small resources, financial resources allocated for mental health. So we integrate mental health within primary health care. We have trained a big number of doctors and nurses and teachers and counselors to provide low-intensity interventions for people who might be affected by the psychological consequences of the toxic stress in Palestine. In addition to that, we have some more specialized interventions that are mastered by clinical psychologists and some psychiatrists, like trauma-based therapies, narrative therapy, trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, EMDR, prolonged exposure. But we always try to adapt these Western developed therapies to the local community and to the culture of the people we are treating.
Okay, Dr. Jabr, thank you very much indeed. Martyn, you listened to that, and in a sense what the doctor's saying, if I dare summarize, is that some Western treatments can be adopted in their conflict zones, but that you can't have a one-size-fits-all type of treatment. So does this suggest that we're coming a long way, or that we've actually sort of been looking the wrong direction for a long time?
The simple answer, we haven't come a long way, we have moved forward, because we need to be clear, even in our Western English-speaking world, there was a time when, if you suffered what we would think of as now as PTSD, at the very best you would return, for instance, from the Western Front, and you would be living away from your family for the rest of your life. I work for a mental health charity, Britain's leading mental health charity for veterans, combat stress. The origins were men returning from the First World War. There was no treatment. They had what we would now call PTSD.
It didn't suddenly start in the First World War. It's just didn't. When it was noticed.
Historically, you can go back. Battle of Thermopylae is quoted. Pepys's London, the Great Fire of London, some evidence that he experienced a post-traumatic response there.
But after
First World War, we could accommodate those, mostly men, returning by living away from their families. No treatment. And that was the best, because in the worst case, I'm afraid, they were put up against a post and shot for what looked like cowardice, but was PTSD. We've come a small way. What we have learned is that for some of those responses to stress, Steve's quite right, the responses are not just PTSD. PTSD is a specific form of reliving of that event. For many, the response might be guilt, anxiety, anger, shame, horror, absolute sense of emotional flatness and disconnect, low mood. All of those can be the responses. If it's the reliving kind of PTSD, that's what I work with. Charlotte, a long answer to your short question. We have come some way. What we have is a small understanding of that. We know, very interesting, the work that my colleagues do, Dr. Nagy, we know the parts of the brain that are involved. Absolutely, the amygdala and the hippocampus. This is the fight or flight response, and the hippocampus is basically our memory processing. We know something has gone wrong with that. What unites Dr. Jabr and Steve and myself is We are trying to address the consequences after that experience has affected in some way their fight and flight and their memory. Yeah. We try to deal with the consequences. What Dr. Nagy is getting to is, what if we could get in and actually repair that part of the brain where we don't know how it's affected, but it does seem that that is where it goes on.
This is the most fascinating side of it, isn't it? There will always be emotional help, and I'll come to you in a moment, Steve, to ask you how you help the people who are suffering. There will always be emotional help, but if you can effectively, you described it to me before we went on air as saying, if you like to reset a computer, reboot a computer, turn it off, turn it back on again, and it's sorted out the problem. If you could find something like that, the applications for this, not only with this disorder, injury, whatever, but with so many mental health issues are enormous, aren't they?
The fundamental problem is we cannot forget by choice. We can forget by accident. We can't forget by choice. Because the number one route, we don't offer a cure at the moment, PTSD, we offer recovery. We want you to get to the stage where PTSD has the smallest possible impact, just as if you had diabetes. You make some lifestyle changes, you get some treatment, you manage it yourself, and hopefully you get on with your life, the smallest possible impact of diabetes or PTSD or whatever. There is not at the moment a cure because that memory of that event is still there. If there was some way of removing that memory, that would be, of course, an absolute game changer. But let's be clear about how far we are from that work at the moment, which is not published, not peer-reviewed, it's not gone through a meta-analysis, it's not gone to people like the NICE guidelines for the NHS intervention.
Which is the National Institute for Clinical Excellence or something like that, yeah?
Absolutely. They decide what treatments are available in the NHS on the basis, do they work?
So Steve, what are you doing?
Great.
Yeah. What are you doing at the moment to help, and does it really help?
Yes, it does. What we do is we give the veterans, and we also work with the police, the ambulance, and the fire service as well. We give them coping strategies, coping mechanisms to work with, which will alleviate the pressure of that post-traumatic stress injury. It's a brain injury. They've been injured. It's just not, you can't see it. And they will practice and practice and practice these coping strategies and coping mechanisms until the subconscious will take over and it becomes a natural process, as if every day you be breathing. So if you were to get an intrusive thought, an intrusive memory, a feeling negatively, the more you practice, the more natural it becomes, the more you can live your life, as Martyn said, getting that pushed and pushed away
so
until
you
virtually
sidestep it, if you like.
It is, what we're doing is we're tricking the brain.
Yeah.
We are so much and for so long that eventually it becomes a natural process.
We don't have very much longer in the programme. Nagy, and then I'll come to you, Dr. Jabr, just very briefly. How extraordinary it would be if you could just put a couple of electrodes here under anaesthetic and it could be cured. Do you think that's a possibility?
Yeah, I think it's a possibility. I think we still have a lot of work, so I want to emphasize still investigational. But for example, electroconvulsive therapy under anesthesia and muscle relaxation, as done these days, is actually very safe and extremely effective for depression. For example, I have several patients, many and my colleagues too, people with major depression, with depression that doesn't respond to anything, treatment, psychotherapy or medications. And some of them even try to shoot themselves, and we do electroconvulsive therapy, and a lot of them get into a remission of these depressive episodes. So it's possible to do something like that for PTSD, for treatment resistant. Of course,
Dr. Nagy, I'm terribly sorry, I'm going to have to cut you off there. Just go finally to Palestine. Yep, a first world treatment in an area where you can't afford first world treatments. It would be wonderful to have access to that kind of research and to that kind of treatment. But the people of Palestine, whether on the occupied West Bank or in Gaza, well, chance would be a fine thing.
I don't think that this highly medicalized, individualized approach will be suitable for a very prevalent problem of psychological consequences of trauma in Palestine. I think what we need is a talking therapy that helps the story of trauma to emerge, the narrative to emerge, and to help people to make sense, to make a meaning of their personal story. And I think an approach that takes into consideration the collective experience in addition to the individual psychological experience is what is highly needed in this context. After all, I think that many people who are classified as patients suffering from mental health disorders, they are sane people suffering from a very pathogenic context.
Listen, thank you very, very much indeed. Thank you to Nagy also and to you two at the table. Dr. Jabr says, you know, it's a talking therapy that is needed at the moment. Well, I suppose in a sense, by putting this idea out there, in more cases, more and more cases such as on this program, we are at least allowing it to become a talking point. Remember, what was it, 100 plus years ago? Nobody mentioned it. It was shell shock. It was pushed to one side. Now at least there is a conversation. Thank you for being part of this conversation if you've been watching Roundtable. From me, David Foster, from my guests, thank you very much indeed. Do hope to have your company next time. Goodbye for now.